Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the demonstrations in Greece. The story, the coverage.
Even the protesters who are here don't want us to see this.
And the dog having a riot. Mexico and Pakistan. Will the attacks on journalists never end? Allegations of murder and torture. And the world's satirical puppet masters.
Start spreading the news.
Their latex creations. And the politicians who pull the strings, if that's what it takes, to keep them off the air.
It is definitely time for your medication, sir.
A little harder, Larry.
The news agenda in 2011 has been chock full of political protests, and over the past couple of weeks, the media's focus has swung away from the pro-democracy demonstrators in the Arab world and onto the country that calls itself the birthplace of democracy, Greece. Since early 2010, Greece has been trying to stave off economic collapse. The Papandreou government's austerity plan, implemented last year, has squeezed wages, cut back on pensions, and boosted taxes. Unlike the demonstrators involved in the Arab Spring, though, Greeks protesting their lot have found media sympathy hard to come by. The economic story is complex. The media have struggled to crunch the numbers and tell that story. Our starting point this week is Syntagma Square in Athens, ground zero in the Eurozone's economic crisis, where protesting Greeks have come face to face with riot police and the global media.
Protesters are back on the streets of Greece as workers go on strike across the country.
The Greek people target the media because they perceive the media as part of the problem.
One of the things that really unite all of the protesters is their hostility against the media. They don't feel represented by the media.
This is why people are shouting slogans against journalists, against particular TV channels, and TV cameras are not welcome at Syntagma Square.
It's very hard to film because even the protesters who are here don't want us to see this.
Given that most of what we know or think we know about the Greek economic story comes from news reports, ask yourself, have you been left with the impression that part of Greece's problem is that its people do not work as hard or as long as other Europeans?
A typical day in the Greek public service, laid back and relaxed.
According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that is simply not true. It's a latter-day case of Greek mythology.
According to the OECD data, in 2008, Greeks worked on average 2,120 hours a year, 690 hours more than the average German, 450 more than the average Brit, and 350 more than the OECD average. According to the Eurostat's data from 2005, the average age of exit from the labor force in Greece was 61.7. higher than Germany, France or Italy, and higher than the EU average. So we're not lazy.
La presse allemande dépeint les Grecs comme d'incorrigibles tricheurs paresseux.
There's a huge issue in regards to stereotypes and the media actually being tools of the construction of narratives and stereotypes. And that's been going around all over the world.
Throughout the Arab Spring, protesters have seen cameras as beneficial to their cause. They've seen the media as allies. Greek demonstrators do not.
They don't wear our shoes. They don't represent very much the reality. I don't trust them.
The traditional big media in Greece, I would say they are, biased up to a certain extent.
They stigmatize social demands, and they're trying to create a monstrous profile from protesters, more or less.
When Greeks turn on their televisions, they see, too often for their liking, someone from an organization like the International Monetary Fund explaining why people are on the streets.
There is some truth in the suggestion that the media in a complex financial and economic crisis tend to depend too heavily on talking to official sources, on briefings from finance ministries, on discussing things with the European Commission or the IMF. They get to know these people who are obviously experts in the situation, and they become a little too dependent on them for information and indeed for the way of thinking.
The media has been overwhelmingly tamed by this. We still think that the IMF knows best. This is the IMF that never saw the big financial crisis coming. So please, the fact that we still even believe in the IMF, to me, shows you the fact that the media still has not learned in the last 4 years from the biggest financial crisis to ever hit us.
Greece's domestic media landscape is not unlike most countries. Several outlets in the hands of a wealthy few. And many of those groups are conglomerates whose non-media companies do a lot of business with the same government their news outlets cover.
The majority of the people in the media world, they get their revenues from other sources, like shipping, construction, or banking. When they opened the media, it was a loss-making exercise, but the media was serving a very particular purpose. It served as a tool in order to negotiate the government and get big jobs in the big contracts from the state.
It's kind of obvious that if you owe companies that take money from the state in order to do several constructions, either that would be infrastructure or whatever, and you also control the media, do you have any doubt that the discourse of that medium would be affected by the interests of its owners?
Add it all up, and the demonstrators have a list of media grievances. And their struggle comes in the midst of an Arab Spring of protests that has produced a distinctly different kind of media narrative.
A few months ago, before anything happened in Tahrir Square, the main stereotype would be that the Egyptians are pathetic, they don't go well with democracy, half of them are fundamentalist Muslims, and then all of a sudden they became the protagonists of the fight for democracy, right? So the narratives changed, and the Western normal narratives changed, right? And stereotypes collapsed.
The Arab Spring is a more straightforward demonstrations demanding democracy, demanding more liberal rights. It's very easy for people to understand that than it is in the case, for example, of Greece or in some other European countries where it's quite hard to see what people are demonstrating about, why austerity is being imposed and what is wrong with the euro. So I think, in a way, covering the economic crisis in Europe is harder for journalists than covering the Arab Spring.
Economics has not yet had its Al Jazeera moment. By that I mean we still have not heard the other voice, or the voice of the voiceless being here alternative economists. Economists with a different agenda, which is not the IMF, which is not neoliberalism, and it's not pursue austerity all the time. Economics needs its Al Jazeera moment. I trust and I believe one day it will get it. But until it does, we will always be against the Greeks and pro the IMF and pro the EU when it should be the reverse.
Because, for the most part, the media are partial to orthodox economic thinking. That term, orthodox, comes from the Greek word, orthodoxos, which means having the right opinion. Not all Greeks share it, nor do they think they are the only ones who will be fighting to make themselves heard on this macroeconomic story.
It will not stop here. It will go to Portugal and Ireland and Spain and even Great Britain. We have an invasion in Athens. The invading forces, they don't wear uniforms, they wear suits, and they don't carry weapons, they carry laptops.
And they're telegenic. They talk in sound bites.
We really have no time to waste.
They look and sound better than the Greek chorus of discontent on the streets. Our global Village Voices now on the coverage of the story in Greece.
What angers many people in Greece is what they perceive to be the selective coverage by some of the mainstream Western media of the ongoing political and economic crisis in the country. For some reason, the media only picked up on these events when they turned violent last week. And to a lot of protesters, this seems to misrepresent the peaceful nature of their movement. Now, secondly, what frustrates a lot of people is the media's singular focus on what the politicians are going to do about this crisis. And a question that is very rarely addressed is what the Greek people themselves are thinking about all of this.
Sensationalism is one issue that affects the coverage of the media, and the other one is media concentration. Has to do with the corruption between the media and the government, and that's what the people protest about. They don't feel they're being represented in the media, and they're mostly bitter about it.
Greeks get often angered by the international media when the coverage is provocative. It insults the people, hurts their pride, and ridicules national symbols. To claim all Greeks are lazy is tasteless and offensive, and it triggers the hate.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Another European country in the throes of an economic crisis is Belarus. However, the president there seems to think the media are to blame for many of the problems. Belarus's currency is down 36% against the dollar. It suffers from runaway inflation and is talking bailout with Russia and the IMF. At a press conference in Minsk that lasted 5 hours, President Alexander Lukashenko said that the frenzy among consumers had been created by the active participation of a number of media for what he called craven reasons. He also blamed outsiders for spreading misinformation through the, quote, trash called the internet, unquote. Lukashenko is often referred to in the international media as the last dictator in Europe. He's been in power since 1994. His treatment of the media has landed Belarus at number 154 out of the 178 countries listed on the Reporters Without Borders Index on Press Freedom. That's the lowest ranking of any country in Europe. A prominent Mexican columnist, his wife, and his son have all been killed in what appears to be the latest shocking incident in the war against journalism in that country. Miguel Angel Lopez Velasco was a prominent columnist for the daily Notiver newspaper in Veracruz. Gunmen broke into their house in the early hours of the morning and shot all 3 family members. Mr. Velasco's column often focused on crime, drug trafficking, and political corruption, and that is presumed to have been the motive behind the killings. His paper has called for a swift and transparent investigation, and the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists has said that Mexico's president, Felipe Calderón, must take decisive action to end a cycle of violence that is undermining Mexican democracy. The country's Human Rights Commission says 70 journalists have been killed over the past decade. Another 13 are missing. 22 media organizations have come under attack, and everybody points the finger at drug gangs out to silence journalists. 5 days after a Pakistani reporter told the story of his abduction and torture back in 2008 by suspected intelligence agents, he has suffered what appears to be a reprisal attack. Waqar Kiani says the first assault occurred while he was on assignment for the UK's Guardian newspaper. He says he was working on a story about Britain's intelligence agency, MI5, and its links with its Pakistani counterpart, the ISI. Kiani says he was abducted, beaten, burned with cigarettes, and threatened that if he reported the attack, his assailants would film the sexual assault of his wife and post the footage on YouTube. That threat kept Mr. Kiani quiet for nearly 3 years. Then he went public. Before he says he was abducted again, beaten so badly by men in police uniforms that he ended up in hospital. This story comes in the wake of the killing of Pakistani journalist Salim Shahzad, a murder for which Pakistani journalists have openly accused the ISI. The authorities in Bahrain have come up with a novel strategy to counter their critics who use social media. If you can't beat them, impersonate them. On June the 9th, Bahraini security forces reportedly stormed the house of Hussein Ali Maki, the administrator of Rasad News' social media pages, and arrested him. Rasad News has been a big player in the information war over human rights violations in Bahrain, especially since most of the mainstream media have been locked out of that story. During the arrest, Bahraini officials apparently acquired the passwords to Rasad News' Facebook and Twitter accounts, and they've been posting pro-government, anti-demonstrator messages on them ever since. Rasad then created a new Facebook page, but judging from the responses on its original hijacked page, many of Rasad's followers have been fooled by the government's tactic. At least 2 other go-to sites for Bahraini activists, BahrainMirror.com and Bahrain Nation, have also been blocked this month. Regular viewers of the Listening Post will know we've been following the exploits of South African political cartoonist Jonathan Shapiro, better known as Zapiro, whose satirical work has recently come to life in latex with his new puppet show called Zanuz. Zanuz is the latest descendant of the grandfather of all political puppet shows, the 1980s British series Spitting Image. Spitting Image taught satirists that puppet shows, done right, can be such a potent form of political commentary that politicians actually fear their effect on audiences. They've cropped up in more than 30 countries, taking aim at world leaders from Reagan to Thatcher to Putin and beyond. But getting the shows on the air and keeping them there can be no easy matter. The Listening Post's Adnan Ahmed now on the puppets that take on the powers that be.
They've poked fun at politicians in Pakistan, lampooned leaders in Kenya, and played Berlusconi for laughs in Italy. Political puppet shows make for potent satire. It's been that way since the days of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and the grandfather of the genre, Britain's Spitting Image.
It is definitely time for your medication, sir.
A little harder, Larry.
80s politics were very extreme. You had a lot of rioting, you had a lot of violence, and a lot of sort of split political views. Reagan and Thatcher appeared on the back of that. That's what propelled them into power. The character of the puppets really came out of the reality of the situation. Reagan, for instance, seemed to spend an awful lot of time asleep, and other people seemed to be doing all the work. So in our show, he was in bed all the time.
I think the appeal with Spitting Image was that it would give you the news of the week, but it would also entertain you and make you laugh.
I'll join you in a couple of days.
And the idea of Maggie and Ronald sort of falling in love kind of made sense. They used to satirise the special relationship very well.
Spitting Image set the standard for puppet satire, becoming the most successful show of its kind on British television. Using latex to skewer world leaders, the show's irreverent humour simplified the politics of the day. There was no escape for Reagan or Thatcher.
It used to go out regularly to audiences of 12 million. When it was successful, 15 million sometimes. And when the Americans bombed Libya, we had the highest viewing figures we'd ever had.
Do you remember Libya? Oh, do I remember Libya? No, who's Libya?
And bombing Libya split the country down the middle because people didn't like the idea of England being used as a runway for American planes. When our show was successful, people arrived from all over the world wanting to do Spitting Image.
By 1994, scriptwriter Viktor Shenderovich was crafting Russia's very own version of Spitting Image. The show was called Kukly, or The Puppets.
Kukly was the first satirical program in post-Soviet Russia. It was fate in the way that Kukly happened when it did. The Chechen War happened, and when the war started, attitudes to the authorities deteriorated sharply, and the program appeared at that very time. And so the opportunity appeared for me to say what others couldn't say.
Kukly was launched on liberal channel NTV during Boris Yeltsin's presidency, a high point for press freedom in Russia. Yeltsin allowed the show to have its fun. But in 1999, Vladimir Putin was elected the new Russian president. Kukly's satire now turned to the German fairy tale Little Zackers for one of its famous sketches, featuring Putin as the evil dwarf bewitching a city into thinking of him as a wise ruler. If Putin got the joke, he didn't like it.
He didn't know what a metaphor was, and he took the story of Little Zackers as a personal insult based on his physiology. He was insulted by the use of the dwarf, as he's no giant. Little Zackers aroused his personal anger, as we know.
The Russian authorities, or Putin in particular, was so scared about being laughed at, being ridiculed. Putin's appeal is very much based on harking back to an old idea of Russia, no-nonsense, tough man, almost a Stalin-like figure. I mean, Stalin would never have tolerated satirical puppet shows mocking him or ridiculing him because he understood the power that that could have.
Putin reportedly sent an agent to ask Shenderovich to shelf the president's puppet. The episode typified the deteriorating press freedom under Putin's watch.
Not only did he manage to take the show down, but he also managed to take over the channel that was running the show.
I spoke to Shenderovich and he said, under a communist regime, well, they just shoot you. Under authoritarian regime, they just buy your show and close you down.
In 2002, just 2 years into Putin's presidency, Kukly was kicked off the Russian airwaves. But the show ran for 8 years, and it had an impact. And as in Russia, South Africa's relatively young democracy is still exploring the limits of press freedom and satirical humour. South African puppet show Zar News couldn't even get on the air, despite being initially commissioned by South Africa's state broadcaster, SABC.
I looked at the political field, the landscape, and I thought, wow, this is like a chessboard with so many different very colorful characters, having a quasi-saint like Nelson Mandela on the one hand, on the other hand, having a quasi-neo-Nazi like Eugene Terreblanche.
South Africa's political figures were ripe for caricature, but ZANU's deal with SABC fell through when the broadcaster demanded editorial control over the show.
You've got to make sure that whatever product you put on air adheres to your editorial policies. That is the editorial control we wanted. The producers wanted to project it as a political issue and project it as in a way that government is influencing it. But the other broadcasters in the country, they also rejected it. Therefore, what does that say?
None of the mainstream broadcasters were ready for a show. I think the people of South Africa are ready for ZANU's, but the broadcasters were not ready. People love politics, but they would like to see politics shown in a humorous way rather than this very flat, conventional way that traditional broadcasters show it. So we decided to take it to the web and bypass the broadcasters, go straight to the viewers.
The ZANU's team say the show has the most popular YouTube channel in South Africa and a Facebook following of over 30,000. And despite ruffling the feathers of the political bigwigs, satirical puppet shows have appeared in over 30 countries. In the quarter century since the first broadcast of Spitting Image, computer-generated imagery and satirical talk shows have thrived.
That was a great one! And like, boom!
But good old-fashioned latex somehow connects with viewers in a way other shows have not.
I think there's actually a very bright future for political comedy and satire, whether in puppet format or in shows more like The Daily Show, because essentially comedy forces you to cut out all the boring bits and get down to the nub of what's interesting, what's vital.
There have been many attempts to replace latex puppets with fantastic digital imagery. And they were very disappointed because the emotions were not carrying through. The latex puppets have got flesh. Kind of forget that they're puppets when you watch a show. There's something magical about them. You leap into a different dimension.
More Global Village voices now on the political puppets that can pack a punch.
Well, Spitting Image had a profound cultural impact on Britain because, apart from being very funny, it also gives the public much better access and connection to politicians and politics than it had previously. It seems funny that puppets are the ones that make politicians seem more human, but that was very much the case. In fact, the only bad thing about Spitting Image is that it's not around now to take a look at some of the people who've got running the country today.
In its purest form, a puppet is a mask, and rather than being ominous, puppets tend to be rather silly, which is usually a good thing to be, for while the rich and powerful might attack and denounce a man who enters the public forum to denigrate one of their number, they are far less likely to do so if the perpetrator of their ridicule is a rather foolish-looking puppet, because you are never going to win an argument with a puppet.
We're going to end the program now where we began, in Greece. Our web video of the week is about a protester named Loukanikos. Luke, as he's now known, has become a bit of a legend in Athens. He's got his own Facebook page with 50,000 plus friends, his own YouTube channel, and his own Twitter feed. Luke is not an unemployed worker or a disaffected student. He's a dog, a stray dog who has become the unofficial mascot of the protest movement. Despite the water cannon and the tear gas, he seems to be having a very good time, and he's probably never been as well fed. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.